You know, for the Conservatives, the reality is in the last election when we poll people, people tried the Conservatives because they wanted to clean up government, they wanted to cut fiscal issues, and they were ready to try something. They weren't necessarily ready to give the Conservatives a blank check, but they were willing to, what I'll say, experiment. And, you know, as long as the Conservatives stick to the integrity in government and cutting taxes and so forth, their numbers are good. But once they're off message on more complex issues, not just foreign policy, but also the environment, their numbers suffer. Okay, I have here the Canadian issue environment, and what we've done is map out, based on the last week of the campaign, what all the committed voters from the various parties, what was driving them. So not surprisingly, we see healthcare when we look at Canadians at the very top of the grid. For Conservatives, honesty in government is important compared to other parties. But what I thought was quite interesting is that when we interviewed committed Green Party supporters, so these are people who identified the Green Party as their first choice, healthcare was the #1 issue, but the environment was only cited by 1 out of every 5 Green Party voters as their top national issue of concern. Now, I think this is good news for the Green Party because what it does is it speaks to where their core kind of value proposition is. And the other good news is that for people who are starting to vote Green and who are voting Green, that they have a diversity of issues and interests and concerns that are very similar to other Canadians. Moving beyond what I'll say a single-purpose party or movement to something that's quite more diversified. The other thing that's actually quite important and interesting from a strategic perspective is look at the block numbers. 19% of committed bloc voters identify the environment. So if you take what I just said in regards to the diverse issue message, that would be good in Canada writ large. But when you're going into Quebec, from my perspective at least, there's an opportunity for the Green Party to potentially have some growth in Quebec, but specifically to target bloc voters. Because the good thing about bloc voters is the bloc voter not only is more concerned about the environment, but they tend to be more internationalist in their views, not as continentalist in Quebec. The other thing that's good news, at least from an opportunity perspective, is that there is the most volatility in the electorate is right in Quebec right now. Because even though the Conservatives, you know, from my previous poll, were in the low 20s, this is a new phenomenon. You can't take a party that people have never voted for since Brian Mulroney and think that that support in the low 20s for the Conservatives is actually rock solid. It's an experimentation for Quebecers. So, you know, I would say from a messaging point of view, what you see is the alignment of your key value proposition or core strength, which is the environment, with a very volatile area from a political perspective targeted to a specific group. Which means, you know, if, and I'd like to say I'm not paid to give advice to the Green Party, but if I was paid to give advice, it would be identify block ridings in the province of Quebec and target them with your environmental and international view on where you think this country should go. The other thing that you should note, it's not up here on the slide, is that when we look at all the Canadians who identify the environment as their top national issue of concern, 60% of them were from Quebec. So Kyoto, which is not surprising, we saw Premier Jean Charest clearly come out in favor of Kyoto. The one premier who was, you know, unequivocal on that position, it's not surprising. He's on the same page as his voters, and the reality is what we can see is voters in Quebec are on the same page, at least I believe, in regards to many of the environmental leaders in this country. So I think Quebec could be quite a significant opportunity for the Green Party. Now, the other thing that we did looking at our CPAC tracking was compile a very preliminary kind of demographic view, and what you can see is that Green Party voters are more likely to be under 40 years of age. Now, what I found quite interesting on this was that the New Democratic Party voters were old. Just like, no, seriously, they're just like the other parties. And, you know, interestingly enough, the New Democrats have always kind of positioned themselves as the party of protest. But I think when you look at the demographics of the Green Party, there could really be a niche for the Green Party to kind of focus on civic engagement and protest and activism and really have a party that demographically reflects the people who are more likely to be in tune with those things, as opposed to the New Democrats, which, you know, you can see 70% of New Democratic committed supporters own their home. They're not renters. While the Green Party has a greater likelihood to have renters. And look, you look across on the home rent, look at the Bloc Party. You know, the Bloc Québécois, more likely to have renters like the Green. So what we're doing is mathematically looking at correlations of similar profiles. So when you're looking at those Bloc supporters, they tend to be younger, like Green Party supporters. They tend to be more international in their view, like Green Party supporters. They tend to be more driven by the environment, at least compared to other types of voters. So I found this actually quite compelling in regards to the profile, and I think it's a key strategic point when you think about where you want to take your party into the future. And, you know, we always like to play with numbers, but what we did was, what here is compare the 2004 election to the 2006 election, and we took all the voters who identified the Green Party as their second choice. So in 2004, you can see the Green Party choice number 2 voters, they were New Democrats, 43%, followed by the Conservatives at 23%, Liberals at 22%, and Bloc at 13%. But look at the last election. Of all the Canadians who said their Green Party was the second choice, 36% were Conservative, 29% NDP, 19% Bloc, and 13% Liberal. What this speaks to is the fact that I think for Canadians that are starting to identify with the Green Party, it's not necessarily an ideological right-left, but it's more of a state of mind in regards to what's going on in the world and what's happening in our country and in our community. And you know, the interesting thing when we look at on the demographic side, almost exactly the same. The gender split is exactly the same to the percentage point, and even the age split is roughly the same. More numbers and lots of charts, and I would like to say that we're going to be sharing all these new statistics with the party, and I believe it'll be made publicly available to everyone that's interested. I'll take one step back because there's a lot of stuff up here. When we do our polling, before we ask people how they're going to vote, we ask them whether they would consider voting for all the parties. So we ask them, regardless of how you actually vote, would you consider voting for the Green Party? Would you consider voting for the Bloc? Would you consider voting for the New Democrats? And then we go to the ballot question. So what this particular chart does is map out the total accessible pool for the Greens, who are Canadians that said, yes, I would consider voting for the Green Party, and then the second choice Greens, and then the committed. So at the very bottom, what we have is a trend line on the percentage of Canadians who are voting Green as their first choice, and then the second layer of Green is second choice, and then the yellow are those people who are accessible but didn't pick the Greens for the first and second choice in either situation. But what you can see is that after the 2004 election, the vote increased from 4%, but more impressively, accessible voters increased from 17% to 23%, which means that the election in 2004 was a success. But hey, look at that trend number after 2006. This goes to the echo effect that I was talking about from a mathematical perspective. That you can see you did very well in 2006, but look at the numbers ramp up in accessible voters, up to almost 35% of all Canadians. So 1 out of every 3 Canadians verbally articulated that they would consider voting for the Green Party. And what we can see is at the high point, 20% of Canadians either picked the Green Party as their first choice or their second choice. But now we can see after what I'll say the echo effect expends itself, kind of a return to the regular pattern.